Hello and welcome to this video series on animal health and biosecurity, brought to you by Farmers Weekly. I'm Janine Ryan, editor of Farmers Weekly, and today we welcome Dr. David Lazarus to speak about African swine fever. Thank you for coming, David.
Thank you for having me on this program.
Please start off by just elaborating on your role at the ARC.
I currently serve as the Institute veterinary epidemiologist, and I coordinate training programs within the ARC on the Steepwood Veterinary Institute.
African swine fever has been a lot in the news lately, and there's recently also been some outbreaks in South Africa. Could you just briefly explain what the disease is and why it is economically important?
African swine fever is a very contagious and highly infectious disease of swine that affects domestic pigs. Interestingly, the disease has two cycles, which starts with the sylvatic as well as the urban cycle that has from pig to pig. Now, this is a disease that's transmitted by ticks of the order, we call them argasids, Ornithodoros mubata, the soft ticks, which normally stay in the burrows of warthogs, and then they feed on warthogs, and when they feed on warthog burrows, they get infected, and when they feed on pigs, they transmit the infection from the wildlife to the domestic cycle. However, when the domestic cycle starts as a disease, pigs can transmit from one pig to another pig. Now, the reason why it is very important to raise more concern about African swine fever, because it's a disease of high mortality, meaning to say you can lose the whole flock within a short period of time. You can lose the whole herd. So, and it's a septicemic disease that presents with different pictures, from vomiting and diarrhea. In most cases, you see bloody diarrhea, you see recumbency, the pig not being able to move, and they lose weight. They become lethargic. And then, because it's also one of the transboundary animal diseases that requires the effort of many stakeholders to control because of the rapid rate at which it spreads. And therefore, we need to intensify biosecurity measures. Interestingly, we need to understand that African swine fever has no vaccine. And so it becomes very difficult when it comes to control relative to other diseases that you can vaccinate.
How long does it take for the disease to develop? So from primary infection to the pig showing clinical signs, how long is that period?
So usually we say there's a clinical sign of incubation period, which from the exposure of the animals to the disease, a relatively short days, 3-5 days, some will go even variable more than that. But there is something we need to understand whenever it comes to disease progression. First, we need to look at the virus you are dealing with. How strong is the virus dose to initiate a disease? Just simply, it happens also in human population where you have people sitting in a boardroom having a meeting and someone sneezes and there are 5 people. By tomorrow, you see one person developing a flu, and it takes somebody about 4-5 days to develop. So there's something that has to do with the properties of the virus. Secondly, we need to also look at the properties of the animal itself, which is the host, because our makeup differs. And so how susceptible is the animal at that point in time to develop the disease? So there are many things that determines the dynamics of the disease. But like I said, we can present as per acute and acute form of disease. And we've recently seen, even in our traditional setup, where our traditional pigs do survive African swine fever relative to some of the hybrid pigs. Now, there's a group of people also doing their own research to unravel what are the science behind those animals being able to survive, because we know that once there's African swine fever, is a disease that can run out the whole flock and you will lose the number of pigs you have. But like I did mention, a lot of things are involved in how susceptible the animals become, how they show the clinical disease, and their survival rate.
And are pigs that don't show clinical signs yet, are they infectious? Can they infect other pigs?
That is another thing, because one is for the disease to be infectious. Once you have subclinical form of disease and the disease is there, chances are the virus are being shed, but then the clinical picture is not being obvious for one to pick. Now, these are the animals that stand a risk of transmitting disease to areas that are disease-free or farms that are disease-free, because it becomes very difficult to pick when these animals are within subclinical form of disease. In some cases, they progress from subclinical cases to present clinical disease. In other cases, you might not be able to pick it that the animal was infected.
That's quite scary, actually, because you're moving animals back and from farms, but you don't even know that they're infected.
Disease, yes.
If I'm a farmer and I suspect that one of my pigs may have AFS, how do I go about firstly, reporting the disease? And secondly, what steps should I take to try and prevent the disease from spreading in the rest of my herd?
So like I said, we encourage farmers to work in a community group, cooperative group, so that they can share information over time. Now, like we always say, when there's a problem on farm A, it is the responsibility of that farmer to declare that openly to his partners within the community and also inform the appropriate authorities. African swine fever is a disease that you need to report when there's suspicion or confirmation. Unfortunately, because we don't have vaccine, we still encourage movement control and biosecurity practice. So farmers should intensify biosecurity practice at all times to ensure that the risk of disease introduction on the farm is minimized. Should there be a disease on the farm, that farm should be contained to protect the spreading of that virus from the farm to other farms. So it is the responsibility of the farmers to always declare and make it open. Because if you hide it and begin to sell your animals, animals will move out of that property to other areas. And like you did mention, a situation where we have subclinical animals being moved secretly. Some farmers will not know, they will end up buying those animals. And also farmers should be careful, because when you visit slaughter slabs, abattoirs, where they slaughter, because it's not only movement of live animals, they are commodities. Remember, this virus is transmitted in body fluid, secretions, and other things, not only through the ticks as well. And for African swine fever, we also know that it's a virus that's very hardy, that can survive on formats like the boots you wear, the tire of the truck that goes to the farm. So we need to always ensure that we do appropriate disinfection, biosecurity, to be able to break the chain of transmission from wherever we are dealing with the virus at that point in time. Now, if you have an outbreak and perhaps you invited animal health workers or veterinarians to come to your farm to do some kind of responsibility that has to do with farm visit, you must ensure that by the time they leave the farm, they do the appropriate disinfection so that they don't stand the risk of taking the virus out of that property to another place. But above all, you must ensure that that property at that point is quarantined and protected against disease spread to other locations.
And so with other animals or with other animal diseases, the animal or the suspected infected animal is usually quarantined or moved away from the herd or the flock. Does the same apply to pigs that may be infected with AFS?
I always tell people it's the same dynamics that applies even in humans. Remember when we had the first case of COVID in Wuhan in China, within a twinkling of an eye, because of the global movement, we started hearing diseases in one country or the other, until the WHO had to institute movement control, which had to break the chain of transmission. The same thing applies to animals. Now it becomes very difficult, and that is why we are pushing for the movement for control and identification and tracing of animals. Because if you have proper animal identification and tracing, you'll be able to trace where animals move from, and you'll be able to test if those animals have been vaccinated, if they have been screened against diseases before they are allowed to move to other areas. So the best in terms of disease occurrence, anytime there's a disease, ensure that you break that chain of movement. And that is why the first thing you do is to institute a movement control. And if it is a disease that can be vaccinated, begin to vaccinate in contact animals within that area that are at risk. But mind you, we are not encouraging people to vaccinate animals that are already diseased. So separate the animals that are diseased from wherever they are found and begin to vaccinate those ones that are in contact or at risk, so that you don't spread the disease further.
So this doesn't necessarily, or this doesn't apply to AFS because we don't have a vaccine for it.
Yes.
But if I vaccinate an animal that is already infected with, let's say, something else, but it's not showing signs or symptoms, does that mean that the animal is more likely to become ill from that disease?
Now, in vaccination, why do you vaccinate in the first place? Is to build immune response against a disease. So vaccination comes prior to disease exposure. So you're building the immune system prior to exposure to the disease. And now, once the disease is already exposed to the animal, the aim is defeated. However, vaccination in livestock production is to ensure that you reduce losses that comes with productivity. Now, there are instances even after vaccination that evidence shows that viruses are being shed. However, clinical disease, and that was what we were saying during COVID, the fact that you are vaccinated does not mean that you don't spread the virus or you can't transmit the virus, but it reduces your chances of severe disease and hospitalization and death. So these are some of the things. As a farmer, Your ultimate aim is to be able to sell your animals when they are due and make money, sell the milk, get money out of your business. So we're not looking at the death. So if you vaccinate your animal, obviously it builds immune response animals, even though at some point, depending on whatever happens, we can't rule out the chances of viral shedding. But the animal does not fall sick to the extent that you spend so much money on treating the animal, and also the animal does not die. When you do your head count, you have 50 cattle on day one. It is your expectation that at the end, when you count, the number should even be higher than that. And that is the overall goal of vaccination. You're trying to protect your herd.
Okay, and then finally, can you elaborate on some research, perhaps, that's ongoing at the ARC with regards to African swine fever?
Yes, because like I did mention previously, African swine fever was restricted to other parts of the country, not the entire country. But we've seen now, because of the dynamism in movement, climate change, remember these diseases are transmitted by ticks, and those ticks are moving from where they used to traditionally be because of climate change. There's a group looking at ecology of the ticks, identifying them morphologically and genetically, typing them to see. And does it really mean that all Ornithodoros mubata that are found in the field have the potential to transmit African swine fever to naive pigs? There are also groups looking at what is the mystery behind the pigs that are infected with the disease but don't die as expected. So there's host loss of group. There are also groups looking at the immunology of the disease. When the pigs are exposed to African swine fever, what really happens in terms of the cytokinins, the immune mediators, the cellular immune response, as well as the humoral immune response, because we know vaccine is still a challenge. So we need to understand exactly when the virus is exposed to the pig population, what really happens within the pig that will be able to determine whether to progress to disease or to provide immunity or death. Remember, anytime disease comes is a chance. If one, will that disease be able to induce sickness? If it induces sickness, would it stop at sickness or progress to severe disease and death? So it's a two-way thing. So we need to see exactly, is this virus able to induce disease? Yes. If it induces disease, does it stop at disease or it progresses to death? So these are areas that other groups are looking at. Some people are also looking at what we call social network analysis, looking at the market access and dynamics of the disease in terms of movement by farmers. Because you go to one province, you buy pigs, you move to the other province. How sure are you that those pigs are not already exposed to the virus and incubating the virus, and you're moving it to another region? Now, there are also groups looking at the diagnostic capability, looking at what are the virus genotypes that are prevalent within the country. Some groups are looking at the antibody diversity in naive pigs, which are not showing clinical disease. They are doing serosurveillance just to look at the picture. Are those pigs having antibodies? Because if they are antibodies, it now gives us an indication that at one point in time they've been exposed to the virus. Now it gives us a picture in terms of the husbandry practice and the information you tell farmers within that place to be wary that you are living within an area where there has been previous exposure to the virus, and now you need to put in place measures that will be able to protect your herd. Now there's a group also looking at what we call full genome sequencing, where they look at the genes that are responsible for this virus and see if those genotypes are related to what is obtainable elsewhere. Because of recent, like we say, African swine fever has been our problem in Africa. But in recent years, it has spread to other parts of Europe and becoming a challenge, Southeast Asia and the rest. So we want to look at, is it the same virus that is now being spread to other parts of the world? If it is the same virus, what must have happened? So those are groups that people are also looking at things. And we have the big hope and confidence that with a bigger picture, you'll be able to consolidate this information and build a very strong control program going forward.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
And thank you for your time in watching this episode. Happy farming.